All right, guys, so we're going to uh, start adding in our sprite stuff from P5 Play and then start setting up for our get our finite state machine working. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is we're going to have to add the code for P5 Play. Oops. So here, just like our sandbox that we were playing around with, we need to add these two lines of code to load the libraries for Plank and for P5 Play. And that has to be loaded after P5 JS and the P5 Sound. We're loading that, and then we have all of our classes. Okay, so that kind of sets us up. Now, we're also going to need to kind of set up for changing some of our code, because we have to get some stuff kind of set up to run Play and then to be able to start testing the different states as we go into them. So when I go into my sketch, we have a player and a coin set up. What we're going to do is we're going to comment out the coin. We don't need them right now. Ultimately, what we want is we want so I'm going to take off this. We don't have an interact, and we don't have a coin. So we'll still have our player. Make sure that that's not running. Okay, we still have our player getting displayed, but we don't really want anything else. Okay, so now that we have play run up, we're basically going into here and we're wanting to set up our sprite, just like what we learned about before. So instead of us doing our normal display like for our dynamic creature, which is here where we're creating a circle, we are going to want to build that sprite in. Okay, so there's a couple things that change. The sprite automatically is drawing, so I'm not going to ultimately be doing this in the dynamic creature, but we wanted to design our sprite. So really what we need to do is we need to kind of decide where is the sprite going to be housed. Now I would say in terms of our classes, since we could use a sprite for collectibles, for enemies, and for players, then the dynamic class would be one of the best places for us to house it. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to add our sprite stuff here. So we'll say this dot sprite is a new sprite. Okay, now we could use a constructor to build this. I'm just going to do this individually so we can kind of see it. We want to build based off of a circle. We want to pass x and y values, which those are our vectors, and give it a size. Okay, so we'll define that. So this dot sprite dot x is going to be this dot position dot x. This dot sprite dot y is going to be this dot position dot y. This dot sprite dot d is going to be this dot size. Okay, now so we gave our sprite its shape, we gave our sprite its x and y position. Now if we go ahead and run, that is our new sprite. Notice that when we go into our dynamic creature, we commented out how we're displaying. It's automatically being done in the dynamic. If I uncommented out my coin, it would also be doing that right there. So we're using that on how we're creating it. Now we need to look at starting to set up our finite state machine. Okay, so our finite state machine is based off of states. So in here, we basically want to create a state, let's say like an idle state, and I want to define this. So for us to be able to do that, we have to kind of put a little bit of a playground in here. So if I go to my sketch, now that I have the sprites created, I could create like a temporary ground here and a temporary platform that I could use while I'm testing my stuff to be able to jump up to make sure that I have my gravity and my sprites working. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we can start plugging in our finite state machine to make sure that it's giving us feedback. So let's do ground and, or we could call it floor, it doesn't really matter. Floor and platform. And these, ultimately, we could probably pull those out, do something different with those. We just need something to quickly test with right now. So floor is a new sprite, and I want to, I'll use a constructor this time because all I'm using is just creating the sprite so I can test against it. It's going to be a rectangle, and the rectangles, when we're doing sprites, everything is drawn from the center position, the exact center of it, and so I will make it drawn at width divided by 2, and I'm going to do height minus 5 for where I'm going to position it. And then I want this to be width long, and I want this to be, let's say, 10 units thick, and I want it to be a static collider because I don't want it to be affected by gravity. So I'm going to basically do that for my floor. So now that I run this, there's my floor right there. Let's go ahead and create a platform. Same thing, sprite. Now this one, I want it to be kind of set offset here. That's something that I could eventually jump onto and I can test for my camera work. So we'll make this centered at width and height divided by 2. We're going to say that it's, let's say, like 300 long. It's still only 10 thick, and it's also a static. Okay, now we could adjust this height. Maybe I want to add like 100 to it so it's not so high. That's fine. I just want to make sure that I can interact with it. And now I also want to implement some gravity so that we can see that everything's interacting how it's supposed to. By default, my sprite for my player should be a dynamic, and then these should be static. So I'm going to do world.gravity.y is, and I can give it a value. I'm going to simulate actual gravity. So 9.8 meters per second is what gravity is. So I'm going to round that to 10 and turn that on. And now my player sprite is actually affected by gravity, and my platform, my floor are stuck at the bottom. Okay, so now that we have that working, and we're not doing any type of update or anything, we're just doing a display. This is all part of the sprite stuff that's set up in the actual P5 Play. So now what we want to do is we want to start creating our states to have the finite state machine control how everything interacts. So that's what we're going to do. So we want to create a new class, and it's going to basically model everything in this state because it's going to inherit from it, and then we're going to make some changes to it. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll go create file, and we're going to do an idle state. So idle state.js. Okay, and I'm going to open this, and I basically want to copy all of this because this is what I am inheriting from. I need to override all of these methods, so I'm going to use this to build this really quick. So I'll call this idle state extends state. Let's build our constructor and everything else. Now this constructor is passing the subject and poppable not to the idle state, it's passing it to the superclass. So I can just pass those in. Okay. And then I will change this. I'm going to just say enter idle state. It's the only thing that I really need to test right now to make sure that it is in there. We don't have an exit yet. We don't have any input, but we also want to make sure that this is updating correctly. So we're going to say idle update. Okay. So what we should see when we have this set up correctly is that this gets called one time, and then this gets called continually, and then we can use that for checking for inputs and all of that fun stuff. Okay, so we need to plug that into run. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to set up our finite state machine to run, and then we need to pass it in that idle state. So in order to do that, we have to first go into our index, and we have to make sure that this is properly loaded. Since the idle state is inheriting from the state, I have to load this after the state class has been loaded, but technically I should be doing this at least before the finite state machine. Definitely before I am doing my dynamic or dynamic creature. So I'll do idle state here. This makes good sense. Okay, now we kind of need to decide where we're going to use the states. Now we did sprites, we did that in the dynamic, but collectibles, those don't really have a need for finite states, like a finite state machine to run. But dynamic creatures, which could be our enemies, NPCs, and players, this would make sense if we had this here. So I want to use our finite state machine. We'll set it in here. So whenever we create a dynamic creature, whether it's a player, enemy, or an NPC, it will create a finite state machine, and then we could ideally pass in what type of state we want it to start in. So that will kind of give us a little bit of flexibility. We could have enemies start in a specific state. That'd be pretty useful. Okay, so we'll need a couple things. Now, I'm going to want to try to optimize this, and part of that is not creating new things all the time. So when we create a dynamic creature, I'm going to identify all of the states that it has. So I'm going to say this dot idle state is a new idle state. Okay, and then I got to pass in who the subject is. In this case, it'd be whatever is the dynamic creature that's currently getting created. So that would be this. And since this is going to be the very baseline one, every dynamic creature is going to have some idle state as like the very bottom. I'm going to say false for it being poppable. So that's really here. I'm answering those two. That's the information that I need. Okay. So now we need to set up our FSM. So this dot FSM is a new finite state machine. And when we look at our finite state machine, it does not need anything when we create it, but we do have to pass it an initial state for it to run. Okay. So in our dynamic creature, we're going to need to pass in the state, the set initial state, but we want to specify which state. Ideally, what I want to do is I want to pass in kind of like the state in here, like a piece of text. I could say idle, and then I want it to look for it. Okay, so this is a good time for us to look at switch statements in JavaScript using the MDM website. Okay, so a switch basically is a finite set of options. Okay, now it could be some type of expression that we are going to evaluate, and then we have different cases that we're looking for. Okay, so here we're looking for the word papayas. If that matches oranges, then we're going to do this. Otherwise, if it matches mangoes or papayas, then we're going to do this. And then we can have a default case if it doesn't meet any of those. We want to build this because then we could say like that state that they pass in could be idle, and then it's going to look for that case and then generate what that initial state is. So that would be a very useful way of doing this. Notice we're using a code block to set this up, and then each case is going to finish off with a colon. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do switch, and we'll pass in that state. And the first case that we have is if it is idle. Okay, so if it is idle, then I want to set the initial state as this dot idle state. That's the state that I want to pass in. Okay, so when we look at our FSM, I'm passing in a specific state, I'm resetting the stack, I'm putting that on the stack, that becomes my current pointer, and then I'm entering the enter state. So I should see, based off my idle state, that it should say enter idle state in my console. Okay, so we need to pass this in. So this is now a new requirement when I create a dynamic creature. So that would happen in the sketch. I create my player. Here, my last thing would need to be that I am passing in the idle state. Okay, so now if I run this, I'm guaranteed to have some errors somewhere. Well, that is weird. Position, velocity, DVD, DVM, friendly, health and state are being handled here. Okay, we do see the enter idle state. I do not see it though when we're in here. I do not see this update. Okay, now when I'm looking at my dynamic creature has a display. It does not have an update. My dynamic that inherits from does have an update, okay, but it's not being called. So let's go to my sketch and we'll look. Here I'm not calling this, so we want to make sure that we're calling that. And now I see this is the dynamic update of player, so that's calling from dynamic. Well, really what I want it to do is I want to kind of override that in my dynamic creature, and instead when I call the update, I want to update the FSM, at least for my dynamic creatures. I could still call the super update if I have something specific that I want all of them to have, but I do know I want to do this in here. So now it's not saying the dynamic update, but it's saying the enter idle state and an idle update. That's what I want to see. Okay, so that means that now my idle state is fully locked in. It's running as soon as I create my player. It's giving it very initially when I'm creating the player, it is setting everything. It's creating the FSM and it's passing in that initial idle state. So I could have this set as like a run state. I could have it set as a jump state. Whatever I need, and then it's going to get called. Okay, so we have this basically linked up. Now what we need to do is in an idle state, we need to add some more stuff. And in our next live code walkthrough, we're going to add a couple more states and then have them transition between the two. So like an idle state, we could use that as like doing like some type of countdown timer. Look for that to start our game. Maybe we're doing like a 3, 2, 1, go, and then we can transition to a run state. Or maybe we're looking for a certain key press. We can also do that. So that means that we have to set up in our idle state something to happen. Maybe we have that timer going off in the update, or maybe we're looking in our handle input, which should be called by our FSM. We're looking for some type of key press to transition to a different state. So that's ultimately what we want. So that concludes this part of setting up our finite state machine now with our sprites. What we want to try to do is we want to control our sprites using velocities instead of directly controlling our position, and do that using the state machine so that we can have it transition back and forth. Okay, good luck, have fun.